Welcome to this year. We're going to discuss the halachas of a crockpot. It is a good example that we can use to discuss various different issues that arise in Shabbos regarding the laws of cooking on Shabbos, returning food to a blech, and other issues. There are a number of halachas, basic halachas, that in a regular household on Shabbos people should be aware of. And usually it's with leaving food on a blech and with returning food to a blech. So the Chachamim prohibited to leave any food that is not cooked to the degree of k'maychal ben derusoi, which is a half cooked, l'chatchila. They didn't allow a person to leave it on a fire before Shabbos because they were concerned that a person would stir the coals. In the olden times, the cooking was done, you had like a box, and at the bottom there were coals, and on top, there was two openings on which you were able to put pots or suspend pots. And they didn't have gas ovens or electric gas ranges, stovetops as we have today, or electric stovetops as we have today. So in order for the cooking progress to move on, it shouldn't take a very long time. They would have to stir the coals. They would have to keep on mixing the coals. Anyone that made a barbecue, a grill, Mustam has a little bit of an understanding of what that means. Now, the issue is that stirring the coals on Shabbos involves a number of malachas. First of all, there's a malacha of mavir, of igniting, creating a fire. Malacha of creating a fire doesn't only mean if you light a fire you light a match, but even if you have a fire and you increase the flame of the fire, there's a malacha of mavir. Additionally, if the food is not cooked, which is usually the scenario which we're talking about, the food is not cooked, so stirring the coals helps the food get cooked quicker. So that is a problem of the malacha of bishul. A person will be violating the malacha of bishul. So in order to avoid this issue that people would stir the coals on Shabbos, the Chachamim said that in order to leave food on the fire before Shabbos, that it should cook during Shabbos, a person has a choice of doing two things. Either he has to make sure that the food is cooked, it's already half cooked, which means that technically it's edible. The person would really be in a rush to run somewhere. It's just edible the way it is. So a person could eat it as is. And also, if a person would want that it should get ready, fully cooked, 100% cooked, he's not going to feel, there's not going to be he's not going to feel the need to stir the coals. Usually it would get cooked on its own. It's not something we'd have to do actively, to be proactive, to stir the coals to make sure that the thing gets cooked in time. So if the thing is already halfway cooked, they can leave it on the fire before Shabbos. Another way to work around it is what's called gruf uktum. If the coals of the fire is covered, if the fire is taken out, you're allowed to keep the food on it before Shabbos, even if the food is completely raw. Now, in a modern day fire, people cook on stovetops using gas or electric or a crockpot, as we're talking about now. Usually, the way things work is a little differently than the way it worked in the times of the Chacham. In order for it to get done, you don't need to keep on turning the flame, turning on the knob that it should get done. Once you set the fire, whatever it is, high, low, medium, or base nishvas, it's going to continue cooking. The food will get done the way the fire is. In the times of the Chachamim, if a person would just light the coals naturally die down over time. There's a need to stir the coals. However, Bisman Hazeh, in our day and age, there's no need for the food to get done to play with the flame. So the question arises, if today, Bisman Hazeh, in our day and age, and the type of cooking utensils that we use today, is there in general, is it to begin with a need to cover the fire, to have gruf uktuma? Does the gezerah of the Chachamim, the decree of the Chachamim not to leave food on the fire unless the fire is half cooked or unless the fire is covered, does it apply to today's modern utensils with which we cook? So even though there's obviously in anything in Yiddishkeit, there's always all different opinions. Any opinion that you're going to think of, you'll find a source that says it. But practically, the mainstream approach, poskim accept that even Bisman Hazeh, even today's day and age, that things are technically different than the times of the Chachamim. And seemingly the concern of stirring the coals is not the same thing as the concern that a person would raise the flame. because people don't have the need to raise the flame as much as they had to stir the coals. Nevertheless, Poskim already for the past few hundred years, even before modern gas stovetops were used, but when other similar things already started coming to the market, the Poskim accepted that such a thing also involves the Gezeres Chachamim. Such a thing, we also have to be concerned with the concern that a person would raise the flame, and therefore either the food has to be half cooked, or the food has to be, or the fire has to be covered, which is the concept of a blech. So getting back to the crockpot, usually people put up a crockpot, they're putting it up right before Shabbos, right? Or whatever, I can't speak for everyone, but I assume that a lot of people do that. So if you're putting up the crockpot right before Shabbos, so the food didn't yet reach Kamaychel Ben Drusoy, it's not half cooked. So what you would need to do is you would have to somehow make the crockpot grufu k'tum. You would have to make the crockpot in some way that it should be equal to what was considered in the times of the Chachamim, that the fire is covered, either the coals were taken out, or the coals were covered with ashes. So how would you do the equivalent to that by a crockpot? So there is a debate in modern day poskim regarding modern day gas stovetops and things like that. What exactly is needed in order to make the stovetop considered grufa ktuma? Is the main thing to cover the fire itself, or is the main thing to cover the knobs? So in the olden days, there was no difference between the fire and the knob. If you wanted to stir the coals, you opened up the kita, you opened up the box that the coals were in, you took your stick, whatever it was called, a piece of wood, and you stir the coals. There was no difference. In order to make the oven ktuma, what you would have to do is you would have to take ashes and cover all that. You would cover the coals with the ashes. This was a gilei das, or like making a mental declaration to yourself. You're not interested in the heat of the coals in a very strong way. But Bisman Hazeh, in our day and age, the question is, what is the main thing, to cover the fire, to cover the knobs? So modern day poskim by law 5, but derech klal, we usually hold that the main thing is to cover the fire. Some poskim would say that you also have to cover the knobs. Some people would say that it's better to cover the knobs, but they seem to agree, as it seems to be across the board, that the accepted understanding is that the main thing is to cover the fire. I'll just mention as I can't say this is a psak halacha, this is a halachic ruling, but it's worthwhile mentioning. I heard from my uncle, he's a shliach in Johannesburg, South Africa, Rabbi Schallenberg Groner. His father-in-law was a baron Popak Olav Shalom. I think he lived in Philadelphia. So he once spoke to the Rebbe before the Nesius, during the lifetime of the Fidik Rebbe in America, regarding a few things in Hilchos Shabbos. One of the things the Rebbe told him was, the Rebbe said that he felt that people make a mistake, that they think that the main thing is to cover the fire. The Rebbe told him he thinks the main thing is to cover the knobs. The Rebbe didn't say it as a psak halacha, it wasn't published in any halachic journal. What it represents is another way of looking at it, that the main thing is the knobs. The main thing is not the fire. It's true. In the times of the Chachamim, by covering the fire, that was what you cover the fire. That's the way how you made grufa ktuma. That's the way you made a hecker. You made a recognition to yourself. You're not interested in stoking the coals. But Bisman Hazeh, in our day and age, covering the fire is nice. It's a recognition. I'm not saying it doesn't help, but Tzad Hasheni, from the other hand, the main place where a person actually plays around with the fire is the knobs. So it's definitely best to be Yotze Kol HaDeis, or however you want to put it, to be on the safe side, to cover both. So how would you accomplish that by a crockpot? By a crockpot, the way you would accomplish it is you would take a piece of foil, silver foil, you would coat the inside of the crockpot with foil, have the foil extend also a little bit on the outside so you actually see it. The whole point of having a blech is that it should be a recognition, a heker, something that you notice that the fire is covered, that's trying to tell something to yourself. You're not interested in raising the temperature. And you could also have the foil go over the knob as well. Now, the truth is, if you have a crockpot that only has the on or off setting, very basic crockpot, you plug it in and it's on, you plug it out and it's off. There's no high, low, medium, there's no different temperature settings. Such a crockpot, you don't need to do any blech. because by default it's a blech. What's the whole reason why you need a blech? What's the reason why you need to cover the fire? Because there's a concern that you might raise the flame. But if there's a device that doesn't have any knobs, any controls to it's either on or off, what's the concern? You're going to turn it off. That's not what the Chachamim were concerned. The Chachamim were concerned that a person might raise the flame. So such a crockpot doesn't need to have a blech in the first place. No, there's no concern it might blow. So even if it's on the highest, so if you have a gas range, a person puts the fire all up to the highest flame that it could get. Nevertheless, poskim say you still need to cover the fire because like plug, you can't start playing around. This guy will say, I don't need a blech because I put my fire to the highest. So that already poskim accept. It does make a difference if you put the fire to the highest or not. But if there's no ability to change the temperature, it's a set thing. It's either on or off. This device does not have the capability of playing around with it. So then poskim accept that it doesn't need a blech. The same thing would be, let's say, a hot water urn, a very basic hot water urn. You plug it in and it's on. You take out the plug, it's off. Or there's a switch on or off. There's no, the more developed ones, there's high, low, the different temperature settings. But the very basic hot water urns, it's on off. For such a thing, technically, you doesn't need a blech. In other words, you can put the water in right before Shabbos, and you can let it cook into Shabbos. You don't need to make sure that it's cooked before Shabbos or whatever.
Brother,
one second. I'll take questions later. Yeah, sure. The problem is that when he asks one question, you ask one question, everybody will ask another question. I'll open up soon the thing for questions. I'm sorry. I just have experience with questions. I just know how it goes. Yeah, I understand. Nothing personal. Just this has to have a certain structure. If not, it goes a little haywire. Now, so getting back to the crockpot. So if there are no different temperature settings, you don't need to do anything. Now, again, there's a number of things you have to be careful about. A lot of people make a mistake. They think, I have a blech, so all my problems are taken care of. It's a general vibe in the air. There's a blech. It's all okay. So I'll give you an example which doesn't apply to a crockpot, but it applies to a blech. If somebody put right before Shabbos on the fire on top of the blech 2 pots, he put, let's say, the soup he needs for Friday night, and he also put the cholent which he's going to use Shabbos by day. So usually the way people do it is they leave on 1 burner, 2 burners, whatever you like to do it, and you have the pots that they're going to need for Friday night. They have right on top of the fire, and the pots that they need Shabbos by day, they have further away from the fire. Usually both pots are not fully cooked, or the cholent is definitely not fully cooked. Now what happens Friday night, they take off the soup and the chicken they need for Friday night, so they're going to move the pot of cholent closer to the fire, right? They want it now to stay on the fire, they get cooked. Now if the pot of cholent is not 100% cooked, you're not allowed to move it closer to the fire. The blech doesn't help you. Because by moving it closer to the fire, you're violating the malach of bishul. You're cooking the cholent to cook quicker. As long as the cholent is not fully cooked, there's issa bishul midaraisa. There's a biblical prohibition of cooking it. So you're not allowed to move it closer to the fire. I'll go even further. If you want to move it away from the fire, not moving it closer to the fire, you want to move it away from the fire. The only way to be allowed to move it away from the fire is if you slide it on the blech away from the fire. What happens? Somebody picks it up. He moves it further down and puts it back down, right? So right now, we just violated the malach of bishul. Why? Because this pot is not fully cooked. When you picked it up, there was no way it was going to get cooked by being suspended in the air. When he's moving it down and putting it down, the moment he puts it down, he now did a new act of bishul. He now did a new act of cooking. So even if you have a pot that's not fully cooked, even if you want to move it further away from the fire, you have to slide it along the blech. You can't pick it up and put it down. So blech doesn't avoid these other issues of bishul, of certain things the person has to be aware, even if he has a blech. A blech doesn't cover that. I give you a similar example which applies even to a crockpot. If let's say there's a crockpot and the person wants to check if the cholent is done. Why? Friday night, he wants to be Yitzhak, the mitzvah of eating cholent, he wants to have hachana for Shabbos day, so he picks up the cover. He wants to see if the cholent is done, and he notices it's not done. He's not allowed to put the cover back on. Why? Because that's called mekarev bishul. When he puts the cover back on, So the cholent, once he took off the cover and the cholent is not fully cooked, it would take it, I don't know, 3 hours to now get cooked. Now that he put the cover back on, it will take less time. Any activity that a person does that it then accelerates, it causes the cooking of the cholent to get done quicker, is violating a malacha d'oraisa bishul, biblical prohibition of bishul. So even when you have a blech is just there. Blech is not a cure for all diseases. All the blech does is that the blech makes sure that the person is not, we're not concerned that the person will raise the flame when Shabbos comes in. But it doesn't take care of the other issues that a person has to be aware of. If he has a pot of food that's not fully cooked, it's on the fire. So getting back to the situation of the crockpot. The best way, as I mentioned before, of making this blech is by having by putting the foil inside, covering the entire inside. It should extend over, and to cover the knob. If that's not, I don't know why that wouldn't be able, that wouldn't be possible to be accomplished. If for whatever reason that's not possible to be done, or you're talking to someone that's not ready to do that, so I would say that the minimum of the minimum would be that you should either take off the knob. When you take off the knob of a crockpot, it's very hard to turn the controls, right? Unless you want to use your teeth, but it's usually hard. So you should at least as a bare minimum take off the knob. If you can't do that, at least tape down the knob. But that's just as a bare minimum to do regarding a crockpot. Now, there's one more exception. There's a halach in Shulchan Aruch which is called k'teira chais, a raw pot of meat, which means if you have a roast of meat in the times of the Chachamim, the cooking habits, as I mentioned before, were very different than they are today. They would cook on top of coals that would take quite some time to cook. So if a person was cooking a roast, a large chunk of meat, and he's cooking it on top of this kira, on top of this cooking utensils they had in those days, it was like a box with coals on the bottom and a place to put pots on top. Usually what would happen is if a person put a large piece of meat to cook right before Shabbos, not an hour before Shabbos, literally right before Shabbos. So then what would happen is that what would happen is somebody use the people on Zoom. 1 second.
Might trouble you for less or less.
Yes, sorry.
So if a person has a roast of meat putting into a crock. So then what happens is that I'm just getting back inside the crock. If a person had a regular pot, if a person put up a roast, a large piece of meat on the pot right before Shabbos, it would not be possible for that piece of meat to be done for Friday night, even if the guy would stir the coals, from today till tomorrow. It's going to take a good few hours to cook. It won't be ready for the Friday night meal. So therefore, the Chachamim said in such a case, we're not concerned that a person would stoke the coals, that a person would stir the coals. Why? Because mimanavsha. If he wants the food for Friday night, stirring the coals won't help him in the least. If he wants the food for Shabbos day, there's no need to stoke the coals. They'll cook throughout the night. They'll get ready. There's no need for him to stir the coals in order for it to be ready. So therefore, a large piece of raw meat, the Chachamim said there's no problem if you put it on a fire, even if the fire is not covered, the fire is not good for ketuma, and the meat is completely raw. You're allowed to put it on the fire if you put it right before Shabbos. Now, today's day and age, Paskim write, this permissibility does not apply to our regular, stove tops, because in today's day and age, the way we cook is that even a large roast, it takes a few hours to cook. The time we reach Friday night meal, at least the time you're holding by the end of the meal, it's very likely will be ready. So therefore, the concern of Shema Yechata that a person might raise the flame applies even to raw meat. But if a person is going back to the situation I mentioned before, if a person is using a crockpot, so a crockpot, it depends on the crockpot, but if a person has a crockpot, that even if the meat would be on the highest setting, it would not be able to cook to be ready until Shabbos day, So then he could, in other words, since the Chacham, they made an exception to the rule. They said you're allowed to put up raw meat right before Shabbos. I'm not talking about ground beef, or a small piece of meat. I'm talking about a roast, large pieces of meat that take a long time to cook. So the Chacham made an exception. They said you are allowed to put this up on the fire right before Shabbos because it's not going to be ready for Friday night meal. So we can't rely on this leniency in today's day and age when our regular stovetops cook things much quicker. But if a person is using a crockpot, which the crockpot, even if this particular crockpot, that the highest setting you would be on would not make the meat ready to eat for Friday night, so then there's no reason why you can't use the leniency the Chachamim established is ma'anam in their day and age for the cooking utensil that they were using. So again, you really need to be able to determine, the specifications of this crockpot. And then, it doesn't hurt to make a bluff. I'm saying from the letter of the law, if a person, for whatever reason, doesn't want to make a bluff, he wants to know what he's allowed to do, not allowed to do. So from this particular crockpot, the meat will not be able to get ready Friday night, even if it would be on the highest temperature setting, he's allowed to put it up right before Shabbos. Again, he has to follow the outline that the Chachamim instituted in their day and age. You have to put it up right before Shabbos. Now, that is regarding the laws of leaving food on a blech. There is another set of rules which is called hatmona. Maybe it's not so famous, they're not so much publicized. Maybe they're not so relevant. I mean, they're not used so much. But there is another set of rules which is the prohibition of insulating food. The prohibition of insulating food has two main parts to it. There's the prohibition of insulating food even on Erev Shabbos, before Shabbos, and the prohibition of insulating food on Shabbos itself. So the prohibition of insulating food before Shabbos, the halacha is that a person is not allowed to insulate food on Friday if the food is covered with an item that is increasing heat. What would be an example of an item that's increasing heat? So there are different items that the Gemara discusses, that Rabbi Shulchan Aruch discusses, which are not so relevant today. Today people don't use them. People usually use towels or other blankets, whatever, to cover a pot, which is not considered the davar hamoisef hevel, is not considered something that increases heat. But there is one example is, let's say somebody takes a pot that's on the stove, that's on top of the fire, it's on top of a blech, and he wraps it up with a pot. And he leaves it like this on the stove top, Friday to go into Shabbos, and the fire is on. So now, to leave a pot of fire on the blech itself is not a problem. But now that the pot is wrapped, is insulated, is wrapped around with something which is a towel. Now a towel, if the pot would just be wrapped around with the towel, it wouldn't be a problem. A person takes off a pot off the fire before Shabbos, is allowed to wrap it on a towel before Shabbos, or even during Bein HaShmoshes, between Shkia and Seis, he's not allowed to wrap it with the towel on Shabbos itself. But here the problem is, it's wrapped around with a towel and it's it's situated on top of the blech, which is a source of increasing heat. So what happens is the heat goes up from the flame underneath the blech. The heat extends to the towel. So the towel, even though it itself doesn't increase heat, but now that it's on top of a fire, the towel is now considered a davar hamoisef hevel, something that's increasing heat. So wrapping up a pot with the towel and leaving it on top of the blech would, if the fire is on, that is, if the fire is off, it's not a problem. The fire is on, that would be the equivalent of insulating something with a davar hamoisef hevel, something which increases the heat. Now, there's a big question, and it doesn't. I'm discussing this really for academic purposes. I use a crockpot, and the other people use a crockpot. So I'm not suggesting that anyone shouldn't use a crockpot, but I'm just discussing the concept to use as a springboard for a discussion and becoming a little bit more familiar with some of the halachas of Shabbos. There's a whole question that came up. A crockpot is a recent, phenomenon. Recent is all relative, but what is it, 30, 40 years old? I mean, it's not. It wasn't common when I was a kid. So it came 30 some years ago. So now the question is, why isn't the crockpot a problem of hatmana? Why isn't it considered insulation? You have a regular crockpot, you insert the pot inside the metal base. the metal base has whatever it is, the things that get red hot, and that is surrounding the pot. You're insulating the pot with the davar ha'moisef havel, something that increases heat. So there's a whole discussion. Obviously, there's always going to be some people that will say that it's best to stay away from it. But again, I'm not suggesting that. I just want to discuss some of the halachic reasons that are given why it's not a problem. So there's a few reasons here. First of all, the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch holds that atmanim b'davar ha'moisef havel, insulating something that increases heat, is only a problem if the thing surrounds the whole pot, or at least most of the pot. If the top of the pot is open, so it's not considered hatmon, it's not considered the full insulation. So you have different types of crockpots, but even the crockpots, most standard crockpot, which surrounds the walls of the pot. But the crockpot obviously does not surround the top of the pot where the cover is. So according to the Alter Rebbe and Shulchan Aruch, that wouldn't be an issue because Hatmon only applies if the whole thing is covered, or at least the majority of it is covered. But here, the cover, the top of the pot is not covered. It's not an issue of Hatmon. That would be a very straightforward heter, leniency, why it wouldn't involve the prohibition of Hatmona. The problem with this is that Alter Rebbe wrote a Madura Basra. Alter Rebbe wrote on the laws of Hatmona, he wrote a Kunter Sachre, which is known as a Madura Basra, in which the Alter Rebbe discusses a lot the deeper opinions and reasons behind the laws of Hatmana. And the Madura Basra, Alter Rebbe establishes a very basic but interesting point. Alter Rebbe says, when a person insulates a pot with something that increases heat, usually the main concern that the person has is that the size of the pot should be surrounded. They don't care about the top. The top doesn't make a difference. If you want something to continuously become, more hot, so the size of the pot, the top of the pot doesn't really, it doesn't make much of a difference. As long as the size of the pot are surrounded with the heat increase, with the material that increases heat, is doing the job. So the Alter Rebbe says that when we're talking about atmana v'davar she'eino v'davar ha'moisef havel, insulating something which increases heat, the Alter Rebbe says that in the Madura Basra, at least it seems, again, Alter Rebbe, you might argue, is not passing this as outright halacha, but the Alter Rebbe seems to hold that in such a case, even though the top is open, it's still a problem, as long as the entire walls, again, there are different types of crackpots, but the crackpot which surrounds the entire walls of the pot, according to the Alter Rebbe and the Madura Basra, would still be an issue of atman. Another leniency that some mention, which personally sounds a little funny to me, but I'll mention it anyway. There's another halacha, which is that atmana only is a problem if the material that's being used for insulation completely surrounds and wraps itself around the pot. If, let's say you're doing atmana, you're insulating this pot, you're putting this pot into a very tiny oven. The pot just barely fits into the oven. So the halacha is it's not called hatman. Why? The Alter Rebbe says there's some space, there must be some space between the walls of the oven and the pot. It's not like a towel or a blanket or another material that was used which completely wrapped itself around the pot and was snugly attached to the pot. So therefore, the Alter Rebbe says it's not a problem of hatman. If you have an oven, again, there's halachas of shehiyah. You always have to be aware that you're leaving something in a place where there's increasing heat. Could involve the question of leaving something on top of the fire before Shabbos, which, as I mentioned before, you have to either make sure the fire is covered or that the food is at least halfway cooked. But I'm discussing it's not the laws of hatman, it's not the laws of insulating in of itself. The Rebbe says it's not considered hatman, it's not considered insulating. So based on that, some people want to say that in a crock pot there's some space between the pot and the base. Okay, the truth is I don't buy this argument so easily, because technically, while there is some space, but I mean the whole design of the crockpot is meant that it should mamish, be as close as possible to the pot itself. And there's technically a little bit of space. It's not like an oven, which is like a square box that you're putting in a pot. There's space all over. Whatever, you can use the argument. You don't want to use the argument. I don't feel fully comfortable with this argument. There's another argument that's made, which has it's a svara. I think it's a svara to consider. It says that no one can. If you ask a regular guy how he looks at this pot, does he look at it that you're insulating the food or you're cooking the food? What is he going to tell you? He'll tell you he looks at it as bishul, as a way of cooking. It's not a way of hatmon. It's not insulation, but it's very basic way of working. There's a difference between cooking something or insulating. Insulating means you take a heat-increasing material, you put it around, and it generates more heat. And then there's partial cooking. So people don't look at this as a form of hatmon of insulating. They look at this as this is a cooking utensil. This is a pot that's on the fire. And the pot has two parts. There's a base and there's the insert. People don't look at this as hatmon. So again, it's another svara, it's another idea out there that people use. Why they say, why don't they explain those that use a crockpot? Again, there's obviously more to discuss, but that is some of the discussions surrounding using a crockpot. Again, I'm not advising anyone not to use one. I use one myself. I'm just discussing the halachas to get a little bit more familiar with the different ins and outs that could be shaykh to a crockpot. Now, you have on the last point is the halachas of returning the crockpot into the insert on Shabbos, which are called the laws of Chazar. There's the laws of Shehiyah, which are leaving a crockpot leaving food on top of a fire, leaving your food in a crockpot right before Shabbos. There's the laws of Hatman, of insulating, which, like I mentioned before, there's really two sets of laws. One is insulating food in a heat-increasing material before Shabbos, and there's also prohibition on insulating food. If, let's say, you have a pot that you took off the fire before Shabbos, and on Shabbos itself, you want to wrap it up with a towel, even though the towel doesn't increase heat, but since it's Shabbos itself, it's prohibited. But then there's the laws of Chazar, returning food to the fire. So on Shabbos itself, if a person wants to take out food from the crockpot, and he wants to put it back onto the crockpot. So more or less, a person would have to follow the standard laws of Chazar, the standard halachas that apply when a person wants to return something to the fire on Shabbos. And there's basically, in generally, there's 6 conditions. The first condition is that the food has to be completely cooked. The food is not cooked, as I mentioned before. There's Isser Bishul. The prohibition of cooking something on Shabbos doesn't make a difference whether you have a blech, you don't have a blech. You're not allowed to cook food on Shabbos. Food is not fully cooked. You wouldn't be able to return it to the fire. The second condition is to make sure that there's a blech on the fire. The fire is covered, right? So I mentioned before, there's how you make a crockpot grufa ktuma. You could cover it with foil, cover the knobs. I mentioned before, if it doesn't have any different temperature settings, by default is grufa ktuma. Then there's another 4 conditions. The other 4 conditions are put into effect for a specific reason. The reason is that the Chachamim wanted that if a person is putting a food back onto the fire on Shabbos, it should be clear that the person is only putting it back. He's not putting it there for the first time. If it appears as if he's putting it there for the first time, it's called Mechzikim Avashal. It has the appearance of cooking, and wouldn't necessarily be prohibited midayrais if the food is fully cooked and it's still hot. There's no prohibition from biblically, but it has the appearance of cooking. It's too close to malach. It's not allowed unless it's clear to the person himself that's doing it and to the observer that the person is merely continuing a previous act of cooking. So for that to happen, there are 4 conditions that need to be put into place. The first condition is when the person puts the food, takes the pot of food off the fire, he has intention to put it back. The second condition is that he has to hold it the whole time, which we'll discuss in a moment what that exactly means. The third condition is that he can't transfer the food from the pot in which it was on the fire into another container and put the other container back on the fire, or put it back from the other container into the original container. Once you transfer to another container, you can't put it back on the fire. And the fourth condition is that the food should still be warm. Sometimes, I don't know, maybe you took something off the fire and you held it there for a half hour, dishing it out to all the guests. By the time you finished, the food was cold. So sometimes it could be a bishul, sometimes no bishul, regardless, without getting into the whole discussions. Practically, it doesn't make a difference. The food has to still be hot, warm, enjoyable to eat as a hot food in order for you to put it on the fire. Taking food out of a hot crockpot is not allowed because there's a halacha called negus. A person is not allowed to stir food on the fire. Based on that, you're not allowed to take off food that's directly on the fire on Shabbos. Unless, let's say there's one piece of chicken that's like isolated all the way on top of a potato and you have no choice. You're not moving around anything and put a fork and take out the chicken. So again, it will be allowed, but otherwise it usually involves you're mixing around the food on the fire. It would be a problem of, even if the food is fully cooked, it will be a problem of negus, of stirring or mixing, whatever you want to call it. So so those are the 6 conditions. The food has to be. The first condition is the food has to be fully cooked. The fire has to be covered. There has to be a blech. Then the next set, the 4 conditions, is that you had intention to return it. You held it the entire time. You didn't transfer it to another container, and it's still warm. Now, in the case of a crock pot, I'm just mentioning this more for you can put in your input. I really don't. I'm not saying this in any definitive way. There could be a I don't know if it's really an issue. I'm not an electrician. I'm not a scientist. I can't tell you. A little bit of a discussion. If you took the crock pot off, if you're taking out the crock pot or putting it back in, maybe the question would be more when you're taking it out. If there's a gush of cold air coming in, so sometimes if the heating element, if the crock pot works on the thermostat, there's a heating element there, then the heating element might turn on if you're taking out the crock pot. But the truth is, halachically, this is a very, I don't even know if it's halachically such a big question. I definitely don't know from the tziyas at the bottom if practically that's what happens. So I'm not going to go there. But I just want to discuss a little bit the conditions of chazar. So first of all, the food has to be fully cooked. Okay, that's self-understood, fully cooked. The next condition, the thing has to be covered. Okay, we explained before what it means to be covered. The next condition is that you should have intention to return. What that means is that it has to be clear that it's not, sometimes a person has no intention, doesn't care. Am I going to return it? Not return it. It doesn't help to have some type of, no intention. You have to have a proactive, positive intention. I want to put it back. It doesn't help to say, I didn't have intention. I would leave it off. You have to have a very direct, clear, positive intention. You take it off, you want to put it back. Now, let's say, I don't think this is likely to happen with a crock pot, but let's say on a blech, you have a few pots, and by mistake, you took off the wrong pot. You thought you're taking off the food for Friday night. Instead, you realize you took off the chon. So then, if you're still holding on to it, poskim say you could put it back on the blech as long as it's fully cooked. Why? Because when you took off the pot, you thought it was the food for Friday night, and you technically had intention to take that pot off. But in the back of your mind, you always wanted the chon to stay on the fire. So when you took it off, you wanted to take the fact that, in other words, once you know it's the challenge, so retroactively, you always had intention to put it back, so you could put it back on the fire. The next condition, which is either biyad, it should still be in his hand, is a little bit difficult or whatever it is. I don't know. Some people use it. Some people use the most lenient opinion here, but just want to discuss a little bit the various halachic options and the best. The better ways of doing it, how to prioritize what is the best way halachically doing it. You're taking a pot of food off the blech or the crock pot for that matter, whatever it is, there's various different levels of what you would call either biyad still in his hand. The first level is literally, it's still in your hand. You don't take it, somebody holds it and somebody else takes out the food. That sometimes that's not practical. So what you could do is, another, again, this is the preferred method. You can put it, let's say, down on the counter, but have it halfway suspended. So it needs to support itself on your hand. You never put it down on the counter. It can't stay, it's not going to be stable on the counter the way it is. So you can still consider it still in his hand. He never put it down on another surface. Now, some people say that that's not practical or relevant. It's very hard. They have a big pot. What am I going to do? So people use this leniency that they put it down, but they still keep their hand there. Okay, there are some people that say that. Honestly, it's a little bit of a stretch, but if a person is already relying on the leniency, there's a better way of doing that. The better way of doing it is don't put it down on the counter. Put it down on top of a chair or on top of a surface that you would never keep your pots there. In such a way, it's clear that this is not the place of putting down the pot. In such a case, if you need to rely on the leniency that you're going to put it down, you just keep your hand there, but at least put it, it's best. Again, I'm not saying, person is whatever. I'm saying this is at least the preferred way of doing it. Put it down on a surface where it's not the usual place where you put down your pots, and then keep your hand there. So like this, that makes it all the more clearer that you're not putting it down. So this is more or less some of the halachas involved and schus of Shmira Shabbos. So the Eibusher should help that we should merit the Yom Shekuli Shabbos, and we'll eat the Shreit Habor is on the fire ready for a long time. It's time to eat it. So the session time chefs, it can't take it from me, Adman.
Amen.